name is proof there was a painter, even if you never see the guy. A building is proof there was a builder, and a watch is proof there was a watchmaker, and design, the creation, is proof there was a creator.
The preacher is here demonstrating a fallacy of presupposition by referring to reality as creation. His evidence of creation is only his circular assumption that everything was created and that creation requires a creator. But if we call it reality instead, then reality doesn't require a realtor.
See, design simply demands a designer, period.
No, it really doesn't. The conceptual conflict between those who accept or reject the science is that religious fundamentalists think everything is being orchestrated from the top down by order of an administrative authority, willing reality to be however he commands, and literally wishing things into being. There is no evidence for this alleged administrator, and no mechanism has ever been shown for how it could know anything or do anything. Evolution, and evidently the rest of reality too, is exactly the opposite of that. Biodiversity is an inevitable product of population genetics amid environmental dynamics, working from the bottom up, producing an emergent pattern from many components that are themselves unaware of their own participation or the product they're producing. But the mechanisms are known and confirmed to work without any planning or desire toward any goal. Everything that exists has properties. Whatever those properties are, determine the conditions of the system, which in turn establish evolution as an incidental algorithm that works automatically, continuously. It's the inescapable result of populations in which there is an increasing variety due to imperfect reproduction, also known as mutation, wherein every individual of every generation in every increasingly divergent lineage varies from all others in some small way. Among all these varieties, some alterations won't work very well and will usually be eliminated pretty quickly, but a few will improve function, and those will be favored for the next generation and the next set of varieties to be tested against it. Several generations of that become deterministic, albeit unwittingly, resulting in improved designs throughout the organism and population without any conscious thought or deliberate intent. Biodiversity is the inevitable product of population genetics amid environmental dynamics, producing designs of staggering complexity and even accidentally exceeding the capacity of intelligent designers.
The invisible things of Him from the creation of the world are clearly seen. They are without excuse, the Bible says. There's no excuse.
Whoever wrote Romans 1:20 was without understanding, either scientific or philosophical, because it is a description of the question-begging fallacy, which is ubiquitous throughout religion. It's a circular argument routing back to the assumed conclusion, what the Bible describes faith to be, looking at things that are hoped for but not seen, because faith is blind by definition, and not seeing what can be seen, and we are blessed if we can instead convince ourselves of what is not really there. Believers use circular arguments like that the Bible is true because the Bible said so, or we believe in creation because we are creationists, because we believe everything was created. I heard the most memorable demonstration of that mindset when someone in one of my own blood relatives, all of whom are religious, said this to me. I believe what I believe because that's what I believe. I believe that, and I'm not going to believe what you believe because it's not what I believe. To my experience, there is no way to get someone like that to understand that the claim is not evidence of itself, that at some point there should be a reason that is not the claim itself, nor the mere assumption of the claim either, which believers also cite as evidence, the fact that they believe it. But just because you believe something doesn't make it true, not even if you're completely convinced. Oh, I don't believe there's a God. I know there is. No, you don't. How many times have you been sure about something only to realize that you remembered it incorrectly or found out that you were misled by an unreliable source? If you can't validate your claim to any degree at all, by any means whatsoever, then you don't actually know what you merely believe. But such belief is stoic, unreasonable, assumed without reason, and defended against all reason. These beliefs are often established by subjective impression or by an authority proclamation rather than being dependent on a tentative and thus correctable understanding of the facts and evidence.
The psalmist said, when I consider the heavens, God knows that the study of science will draw us to Him. Satan knows that too. So Satan has worked really hard in the field of science to make sure it pushes kids away from God.
And notice how believers profess to know things no one even can know, citing alleged facts that are not facts. baseless speculation, but they just call it out as if it's real, as if you could prove it. And believers of every faith admit that they can't show and thus don't know really whether any gods or devils exist. Yet, every religion thinks that they know all of these specific details about both of these things, including what their God knows or thinks or likes or hates. Have you noticed that every believer's personal God always agrees with that believer on every topic? Somehow God always shares every believer's opinion, even when it goes against the opposite opinion that God also shares with other believers from every other denomination. Funny how that works. Every denomination of every religion believes they're the chosen ones, that they're the one true faith, and that everyone else in the world will learn the error of their ways at some moment of final judgment. They all say theirs is the absolute truth, even when they contradict each other, and obviously none of them really knows any such thing. For example, there is no Satan. Even if there really was a God, and even if it was the Christian God, there still wouldn't be a Satan. The devil character is evidently a human invention, made of a combination of misunderstood scriptures and adapted mythologies of non-Abrahamic religions integrated with some heavily embellished folklore. It's obviously false, completely, made up, with no basis in fact at all, not even a kernel of truth, not at all real. And even if there really was a God, and even if it was the Christian God, there still wouldn't be a Satan or a hell either. Evolution would still be an inescapable fact of population genetics, fossils, and phylogeny. The Bible would still be wrong about most things, and creationism would still be wrong about everything, or everything but that one thing. And not even the existence of God would change any of that.
And we need some good godly science teachers to get involved in the school system and turn this thing around, okay?
Now the preacher wants to get what he calls good godly science teachers into the schools, not to teach science, but to subvert and undermine science in both principle and practice, to misrepresent evolution, to thwart analysis and understanding, to stifle curiosity and stunt critical thinking in order to indoctrinate faith, violating the First Amendment by preaching unsupported and thus indefensible religious assertions to sequestered students. That, more than anything else, is why I do what I do, because I think students have a right to be told the truth rather than being misled by misrepresented, deliberately deceptive, politicized propaganda and pseudoscience nonsense, such as the preacher has been preaching all throughout this seminar.
And by the way, we can prove the existence of God by the impossibility of the contrary. It's impossible that there not be a designer. It's just not possible. There had to be a designer, okay?
I'm glad the preacher admits that some things are not possible. I've heard a lot of other people just assume that anything is possible, but we know that's not true, because we know of many things that are not just improbable, they are impossible. A single roll of a six-sided die cannot roll pi, for example. A cow cannot jump over the moon, like in the old nursery rhyme. The strength of its legs, bones, and muscles cannot generate sufficient lift to launch the weight of the beast to escape velocity. That's not just improbable, that's a mathematic impossibility. Since we cannot honestly say that something is true when we cannot show and thus don't know the truth of it, then in order to honestly say whether something is possible, there must be a precedent or parallel or verified phenomenon indicating that such possibility exists. We don't have that for God. The only possibility of God that the preacher could think of was what he calls the impossibility of evolution. Is evolution possible? Let's look for the precedent, the parallel, the verified phenomenon. And I would say that the fact that we can see evolution happening certainly establishes its possibility, as does the fact that we can control its progress forward and also trace it backward through both fossils and the genome. We also have the preacher's own unwitting admission that micro and macroevolution are both observed, although he didn't use the word macroevolution because he didn't know what it means. The preacher even agrees with the validity of taxonomic cladograms, not just between different species, which should be enough, but beyond that, to the genus and family level at least. It goes beyond that, too, with every indication that it keeps on going, and there is no indication, literally no possibility, that it doesn't keep on going. Because there's nothing to show that any of the sort of macroevolutionary limitations that creationists insist must exist. They don't. So we have a possibility, probability, and established fact of evolution, but still not even a possibility for God. Understand that not yet knowing any possibility is not the same thing as knowing an impossibility. Both should be demonstrated before either can be honestly claimed. And there could be many things that are possible, probable, or even true, but we can't yet say that they are because we don't yet know that they are. And it is dishonest to say that you know things to be true when you can't demonstrate that knowledge or present the evidence to show the truth of it. So we can't use the alleged impossibility of evolution to establish the possibility of God by comparison, because that would be a false dichotomy, and logical fallacies don't count as evidence. I have to remind people of this quite often. However, it's not just that we don't have a possibility of God. It's actually worse than that, because God is defined by his miraculous nature, and miracles have essentially the same definition as magic, being the evocation of supernatural forces or entities to control or forecast natural phenomena in ways that are inexplicable by science because they defy the laws of physics. And anything that defies the laws of physics would be physically impossible by definition, and thus God is physically impossible by extension. But God is not physical, you say. But that doesn't help, because that could imply that God is logically impossible too, because how does God control physical things without a physical aspect? If God exists outside reality, then he does not exist in reality. If God is beyond space and time, then God is nowhere, and he never is. Now, there might be a metaphysical possibility that I'm not yet aware of, but all such arguments that I've yet seen consider different conditions of an alternate universe, and that would be inapplicable to the sort of pan-dimensional uber-cosmic overlord that most believers argue for these days. And many of these God concepts are riddled with absurdities, atrocities, inconsistencies, and contradictions of theology, like the paradox of how Jehovah is just a spirit that no man can look upon, except for the 72 people God allowed to look upon him. And how could God have foreseen the future, knowing everything that we will ever do, such that we can never surprise him or do anything that is against his will, but we have our own free will? That's not possible. That's a paradox, and there are plenty of them. How could God be omniscient and infallible, yet regret the things he has done or what he has created? All of these quandaries can be answered with one explanation. The story has so many holes because it is just a story, and people are not consistent storytellers, especially not when they mix mythologies of so many different religions, as they obviously did in the compilation of the Bible. And my point is, the preacher cannot prove God, particularly not by the impossibility of evolution, because evolution is evident, apparent, testable, demonstrable, practically applicable, and God is not. God is none of those things. If anything, God could be, and evidently is, entirely imaginary.
I like to show evolutionists this picture. I say, guys, here we have, as far as I know, the world's largest rock group. You know of a bigger one? I'd like to see it, okay? I'll say, do you think there's any way George Washington's face could have appeared on this rock by chance? I say, no, it was designed by a guy named Borglum. It took him a long time to build it. Okay, very good. Now let me ask you a question. You say there's no way this face could appear on the rock by chance. You don't think wind could have done that? Abrasion, exfoliation, thermal expansion of the rock? Nothing? Nope, happened by design. Okay.
There is a remote possibility of that, yes, as we have seen other rock formations that can look like human faces. But it's highly improbable, especially at this resolution and composition. This is well beyond pareidolia, more than sufficient to confirm the deliberate intent of an intelligent agent.
Now let me ask you this question. Do you think George Washington himself, with 50 trillion cells in his body and all these complex systems, happened by chance? I say, yeah. Now wait. You don't think his face could appear on a rock by chance, but you do think his whole complex anatomy could happen by chance.
When the preacher says by chance, he means naturally, incidentally, as opposed to deliberately. In other words, we think the sculpture had to be created intentionally, the same as our cars and paintings and buildings, because there's no way these things can come about naturally. But we know that living things don't have to be created because they do develop naturally, without any hint or even possibility of intent. We sculpt our gods of rock and clay, and then we pretend that they did the same with us. But that raises a similar quandary. I would ask the preacher why he thinks that his God can make planets and dinosaurs and everything that humans can't make, But he can't make anything humans can make. He can't make a box, or a boat, or a book, or a building. He supposedly controls everything everywhere, and he can wish infinite intricate systems out of nothing, but he needs people to do his work for him? To put up a tent or construct a crate? Because slapping a few boards together is somehow beyond God's ability? He can't even give dictation properly, only ever communicating in the most questionable and dubious manner imaginable, which is why all the scriptures of every religion got so many things wrong. All the scriptures are scientifically and historically, ethically, and morally wrong.
Are you dumb in any other area, or is that the only one,
Remember that the Dunning-Kruger effect is when those with little or no competence grossly overestimate their own ability. And narcissism has the same effect, but with the added defect of being unable to accept correction, causing one to overreact to criticism, which is why some folks who have never studied a given topic still think they know more than every expert, such that the willfully ignorant criticize those in the know as if the scholars are the dummies. Not surprising when their scriptures teach that wisdom is foolish and that only the fools are wise.
Then they tell kids that plants are adapted to their environment. Adapted?
Yes, we have plants that live underwater and plants that live on land, some in fertile fields, others in semi-arid deserts, and some varieties have subsets that live in different climes, tropical or temperate, and each one has their own modifications to cope with the temperature or the quality of the soil or what have you. That's what evolution is all about, so that the descendants of any single ancestor can spread as far as possible across the world.
Yes, boys and girls, gills are an adaptation to living in water. Oh, well, how did they live before they adapted the gills? Well, you see, Mr. Hovind, for millions of years, they all died. None of them lived until they adapted the gills. Oh, I see.
I think that textbook is apparently referring to the structure of fish gills being mounted on paired and duplicated gill bars and covered by an operculum. But the basis of gills is much simpler than that and much more widespread. Gills, like lungs, are an adaptation to increase oxygen absorption. If you're small enough, like unicellular eukaryotes, then your energy consumption isn't enough to require lungs or gills. And likewise, low-energy organisms like parazoans and ctenophores don't have gills. They don't have any organs of any kind. They're just like microbes in that about the only thing they do have are cilia, which they use to move oxygen-rich water over their surface area because they extract oxygen from the water through diffusion alone. And that's how gills work too. The easiest way to improve diffusion of oxygen from water is to increase the surface area wherever the water flows over or through the body with a branching frond structure that allows blood capillaries to diffuse oxygen in and simultaneously release carbon dioxide out. That's what a gill is. And most marine animals have something like that arranged or structured differently depending on their lineage or clade. Some insects have gills, for example, though terrestrial insects have only trachea, no gills and no lungs because they don't need them being that small. Fish and all other vertebrates are in the order Chordata, and for that clade, the gill arrangement is shown in basal hemichordates, worms in which the gills are no more than pharyngeal slits, just like what we have in the vertebrate embryo. So the ancestors of fish had already adapted gills even before there were fish. The immediate precursors of fish were little more than tiny swimming worms themselves, already with these gill slits, which persisted through primitive fish too. It was much later species that eventually increased the size of their gills with rows of gill bars enabling them to grow much larger.
Why don't they say it's a design feature? See, they avoid using the word designed because then some kid's going to say, who's the designer?
Now we know better that some things will still turn out this way whether there's a God or not. We can see how a deterministic process will eventually incrementally develop its own design as a result of trial and error and descent with modification of a wide variety of unwitting participants in an unconscious, ongoing, perpetual experiment.
Adaptations for living on land. Legs. Oh yes, boys and girls, legs support the body's weight as well as allow movement from place to place. Well, that's true. It doesn't prove they adapted by themselves, though.
While we have evidence of that in Hox genes and in embryology, most of our proof of the evolution of legs comes from the fossil record, from having every stage of this developmental sequence literally set in stone, with every detail, bone by bone, of that development depicted in sequential order, so that what was written in the rocks hundreds of millions of years ago can still be read today. Almost as if an immortal deity was trying to tell us how it really happened.
Lungs. Oh boy, the delicate structure of a fish's gills depends on water for support. On land, lungs carry out gas exchange. That's true. That's not proof one changed to the other, though.
Some of our ancient fish ancestors also had what they call a buoyancy bladder, which helped them maintain ballast and an upright orientation, which is one reason why sick or dead fish tend to swim sideways or float upside down. That buoyancy bladder also works as a lung, and some fish used them as lungs or even developed them into lungs, which is how we inherited lungs. And we've already talked about the embryological evidence of that, the fact that there are vertebrate embryos with pharyngeal arches, the developmental remnants of what would become gills in our ancestors. But we also have evidence from taxonomy and from the fossil record too. Amphibians are vertebrates like we are, and even though they are a sister clade to amniotes, they are obviously karyotypic of our common ancestors. Some of them have gills instead of lungs, and some have both gills and lungs. Another example of evo-devo, where evolutionary development parallels embryological development. They're also the only clade in which some of them can be fairly said to recapitulate their phylogeny, in the sense that they go from having gills in infancy to having only lungs as adults. Although some modern amphibians have neither gills nor lungs. The flat-headed frog of Borneo and several species of plethodontid salamanders have a neotenous mutation in which the lungs never develop. But they don't need them because, 1, they're small, and 2, they're cold-blooded, so low energy demand, and 3, they don't have the keratinized epidermis that we have that keeps the outside outside, so that if you spill something on yourself, you can usually just wash or wipe it off and it won't get into your bloodstream. But frogs and salamanders soak up everything through their skin like a paper towel. And that leaves them susceptible to toxins, ironically, since many of them are toxic themselves. But it also means that they absorb oxygen right through the skin, enough that they can even live on land without ever taking a breath.
They just make this mental, imaginary connection in the kids' minds.
If you can't immediately observe something, like the operation of a political system, for example, or depreciation of currency, or the movement of an electron to establish a covalent bond, sometimes you have to explain these things, perhaps with illustrations or with a model. We can't demonstrate all of evolution at once, but there are many ways to trace and confirm most of it one part at a time. So evolution is not imaginary like religion is.
I've got a Casio Databank stopwatch, watch, okay? Holds 300 phone numbers. It's a calculator, stopwatch, an alarm clock, and a countdown timer. It does not tell time. I have to look at it, but it's a pretty amazing machine. $70 at Walmart. I was in Japan a couple years ago, but I did not see the guy who makes the Casio Databank watch. I never saw him. Do I have to see the guy who made it to believe he exists?
No, but you already have sufficient evidence of him, which you do not have for your God.
Is it logical for me to stand here in Tennessee and say, I believe there's a watch designer in Japan that made this thing? Is that logical? Even if I never see him? Sure.
Well, I suspect that watch was probably designed on a computer by a whole team of people, and then put together on an assembly line, maybe by robots. But otherwise, since you know that the only way watches can exist is to be made by people because they're not alive and thus cannot reproduce, then sure.
Would it be illogical for me to say, I've never seen him, so I don't believe he exists? That would be totally dumb, wouldn't it?
Here and throughout this whole episode, the preacher is rehashing the watchmaker argument posed by William Haley in his book Natural Theology in 1802. The failure of Haley's argument in this application is twofold. One, Darwin's explanation of the mechanism of natural selection, written 57 years later, neatly answers Paley's position with an autonomous system capable of incidental design. And two, Paley's argument contrasts the watch as designed as compared with rocks as an example of something that is not designed. Except that having as yet no known system of natural design, Paley simply assumed, as others at that time had, that the universe was analogous to a device of clockwork precision, which we now know it is not. The cosmos is a boiling chaos that only seems peaceful because we see it in such slow motion.
And you don't have to see the Creator to believe he exists, okay?
You don't have to see or know anything in order to believe all sorts of nonsense. You don't have to see Santa Claus or Bigfoot, Slender Man, or extraterrestrial lizard people to believe in all of those. In fact, knowing better often gets in the way of whatever you'd rather pretend.
Evolutionists argue against design using arguments they designed. Think about that one.
Except that while people can make up fictional stories and they write books full of tall tales, we didn't write what was written in the rocks or in our DNA. If you want to assume that a deity is responsible for those things, then God is conveying a very different testimony than any of the ancient fables that were all written by mere fallible men.
Here's a great book talking about the complexity of living things at a micro scale. We sell the book at our website. Michael Behe wrote this on Darwin's black box.
Remember that the preacher gave this speech back in 2005. In that same year, Michael Behe testified in the Kitzmiller versus Dover trial, which showed that the intelligent design movement was involved in a criminal conspiracy to get around the law against teaching creationism in public schools. They had a creationism textbook called Of Pandas and People in circulation until the Supreme Court ruled that creationism is purely religious and not scientific in any sense, and so it was a First Amendment violation to teach it in public schools. So the ID proponents keyed in a macro command into the next edition, changing every occurrence of creationism to intelligent design, including the definition, proving that they are one and the same. The macro also changed every occurrence of creationists to design proponents. The fraud was exposed by a typo, producing the term "design proponentists," showing deliberate intent to conceal the fact that intelligent design is creationism, despite all their testimony to the contrary. And consequently, the Bush-appointed Republican conservative Christian judge lamented how it is ironic that several of these individuals who so staunchly and proudly touted their religious convictions in public would time and again lie to cover their tracks and disguise the real purpose behind the ID policy.
He spends a whole chapter describing the hair on a bacteria. That hair is so complicated, it's attached to a little tiny motor. The motor is so tiny that 8 million of them would fit in the cross-section of a human hair, but the motor turns 100,000 RPM. Let's see you build a motor like that.
The Kitzmiller v. Dover trial was important because it showed how every testable claim made by the intelligent design theorists had already been falsified scientifically even before they were exposed in a court of law. Regarding the bacterial flagellum, which the preacher here refers to as a hair, Michael Behe testified that removing any one part of the bacterial flagellum will prevent it from acting as a rotary motor. The opinion of the court, however, was that Professor Behe excludes, by definition, the possibility that a precursor to the bacterial flagellum functioned not as a rotary motor, but in some other way, for example, as a secretory system. And then, after having heard all of the arguments for irreducible complexity and seeing them all systematically refuted by a Christian biologist, the court ruled that Professor Behe's claim for irreducible complexity has been refuted in peer-reviewed research papers and has been rejected by the scientific community at large.
Pretty amazing. And as things get smaller, the world they live in feels more sticky to them. The viscosity of the fluid seems greater. So a bacteria swimming through water is about like a person swimming through peanut butter. And that little motor is so powerful and turns so fast, that bacteria can swim about like a person going 60 miles an hour through peanut butter.
I asked a biologist about this, and he said, well, maybe not peanut butter, unless that's that really runny kind. But to illustrate how important this isn't, remember that if we account for the difference in size, then some ants can run as fast as 360 miles per hour. Being able to lift 5,000 times your body weight isn't that impressive when your body weight is so trivial that none of our scales can even detect it.
We got a little model of it in our museum if you want to come down and see how they work.
I should note that creationists like to draw these things to look like a gadget you might find for sale at the Home Improvement Depot because they want it to look intelligently designed. But like all aspects of biology, the reality is messier and more organic than that.
And the textbook says, humans probably evolved from bacteria more than 4 billion years ago.
Surprisingly, the preacher has unwittingly revealed an actual falsehood in the textbooks, though it isn't the one he intended. The book should not have said that humans evolved from bacteria for a couple of reasons. One, because that ignores or skips over at least 70 intermediate clades that we have names for so far, and thus gives the wrong impression that bacteria turned directly into people. 2, the transition from prokaryote to eukaryote is technically not an evolutionary process. Remember that evolution is descent with inherent modification, but the combination of endosymbiosis and horizontal gene transfer are very different processes than what occur at every other level from which we can point to the sort of ancestor-descendant relationship that could rightly be called evolution.
What? They can swim through peanut butter 60 miles an hour. We should sign them up for the Olympics, man. We evolved from them. We're getting worse, not better. It's a lie. Nothing this small and complex could have happened by chance.
Wrong. Nothing this small and complex could have happened by design. We have studies showing how it could have come about naturally, unintentionally, but we don't know of any way anyone could have done it deliberately, nor why they would have, knowing that it wasn't necessary, because this could have happened on its own anyways. You'd first have to show that there is a designer, then show that said designer is actually capable of doing this. Until then, it just looks like the preacher is admitting that the real explanation is beyond him, so he's blaming everything on a magic invisible man.
This is a great book that we sell in our bookstore. Just simple illustrations. Could a box evolve? Could an ink pen evolve? Could a paperclip evolve? It just goes through a bunch of simple things and shows it just can't happen, okay?
Because none of those things are alive and therefore cannot reproduce. Evolution is a variance of allele frequencies in reproductive populations over many generations. Why is it so hard, even for this preacher, to understand that a paperclip doesn't have DNA and it can't make babies?
Then they talk about the origin of life. Yes, boys and girls, how living things started from non-living matter. This is pure baloney, how they teach this in the books. We're going to cover that after a quick break. Cover a few more lies in the textbooks and then tell you what you can do about it. Some practical steps to fix the problem right after the break.
I am looking forward to that. Stay tuned.